The 1970s gave us some of the greatest music ever recorded. Stevie Wonder, Led Zeppelin, Fleetwood Mac, Lynyrd Skynyrd, The Who, a decade that felt, from the outside, like an endless run of triumph. But here's what the nostalgia skips over. Behind every iconic record and every sold-out arena, there were moments when everything broke, careers ended overnight, stages became crime scenes, and in some cases, people didn't come home. This is a countdown of 10 massive music disasters from 1971 to 1979. Some of these you know. Some of them have been half forgotten. And by the time we get to number one, you'll understand why we owe it to the people involved not to let them disappear. Let's get into it. Number 10, John Lennon, Sometime in New York City, 1972. Imagine all the people. By June of 1972, John Lennon was one of the most famous human beings alive. He'd just released Imagine the previous year, an album so critically adored it might as well have been handed to him on a gold tray. And then, less than 12 months later, he turned around and released an album so thoroughly rejected that Rolling Stone called it, and I'm paraphrasing carefully here, incipient artistic suicide. Sometime in New York City was a double album, political songs, all of them, set to fairly basic rock arrangements. The High R.A., Angela Davis, Attica State, apartheid, all causes Lennon genuinely believed in, and that's not the problem. Lennon had every right to make political music. He'd been doing it since the 60s. The problem was the execution. The lyrics read more like newspaper headlines than songs. The music felt rushed, and it was, because Lennon's whole philosophy was to get the songs out while the headlines were still fresh. It was recorded in roughly 3 months and released the same spring, and the critics came for it hard. Here's what makes this sting more than just a bad review. Lennon himself admitted the reaction got to him. He said it almost ruined it, that the criticism made him feel like he'd traded his identity as a poet for something closer to a pamphlet, that he'd become a journalist instead of an artist. And here's what's wild. At the exact same moment he was making this album, the Nixon administration was trying to deport him from the country over a marijuana conviction from years earlier. The FBI was monitoring him. He was fighting the U.S. government and trying to make meaningful music simultaneously, and the music suffered for it. The album peaked at number 48 in the United States. For John Lennon, the man behind Imagine, the man behind the entire first half of the 70s solo run, number 48. He pulled back from the political arena almost entirely after that. And if you've ever put everything you believed into something, poured your whole conviction into a statement, and watched it not just be dismissed, but mocked, you know that's a specific kind of wound, not just failure, public humiliation by the people you most wanted to reach. A brotherhood and sisterhood of man. Sometime in New York City is a footnote in a discography full of masterpieces, but as a disaster, it shaped everything that came after it. You may say I'm a dreamer. Number 9, Fleetwood Mac, Tusk, 1979. Here's a question worth sitting with. What do you do after you make one of the best-selling albums in the history of recorded music? If you're Lindsey Buckingham in 1979, the answer is you spend $1 million making something that deliberately sounds nothing like it. Rumors had sold over 25 million copies. And I know that number doesn't even feel real when you say it out loud. $25 million. The label was expecting a follow-up that would do the same thing. The commercial logic was airtight. Make rumors again, or something close enough that radio station know what to do with it. But Buckingham had been listening to punk rock, to new wave. He wanted something stranger, raw, harder to classify. So they built a home studio inside their compound in Bel Air and spent months, plural, recording a double album they called Tusk. At one point during the sessions, Buckingham brought in the USC Trojan Marching Band to play on the title track, an actual college marching band on a Fleetwood Mac record. And he wasn't being ironic. Warner Brothers heard the finished album and panicked. Their financial projections for a Rumors follow-up were enormous, and this was not what they had in mind. So here's the part that almost nobody talks about in an attempt to build early buzz. Right, the label broke with standard industry practice and let FM radio stations broadcast the album before it was officially released. They were trying to generate excitement. What they actually did was let millions of people hear the whole record before they made a purchase decision. And a lot of those people decided not to buy it. Tusk sold roughly 4 million copies. Under any other set of circumstances, 4 million is a phenomenon. After Rumors, it was a commercial catastrophe. The label lost money on the project. The band's commercial ceiling never fully recovered to that level again. But here's the thing that gets me. Buckingham was right. Tusk is a genuinely interesting album. Weird, sure, but interesting in a way Rumors was never even trying to be. He made the honest record instead of the safe one. And if you've ever done the thing you knew you needed to do, the real thing, the creative thing, the thing that came from somewhere true inside you, and then watched it get punished while the safer choice got rewarded, you understand this better than any review could explain. Sometimes being right and being vindicated aren't the same event. Real talk, only 9% of you are subscribed. That hurts. We're spending hours digging through archives, fact-checking every detail, bringing these stories back to life. And if you're watching this far, you clearly care. So hit subscribe. It's free and takes 2 seconds. Now, to my subscribers, barely any of you have joined the membership. And honestly, that stings even more. You know the work we put in. You keep coming back. If these videos have ever made you feel something, if this music means something to you, join the membership. It's one coffee a month, and it's the only way we keep this going. Let's build this together. All right, back to it. Number 8, Neil Young and the Tonight's the Night Tour, 1973 to 1975. Neil Young walked out on stage at a theater in 1973 and told the audience they were about to see the worst show they'd ever witnessed. Then he played it anyway, and he meant it. You probably know Neil Young from the gentle acoustic poetry, Heart of Gold, Old Man, Harvest, the delicate folk rock troubadour who belonged on a porch, not a stage. But by the fall of 1973, something had broken inside him. In the span of about 10 months, he'd lost 2 people very close to him to the same thing. Guitarist Danny Whitten died of a heroin overdose in November 1972. Neil had let him go the same night, told him he was too far gone to be on the road, gave him $50 for a flight home. Danny died that evening. Then in the summer of 1973, Neil's roadie Bruce Berry died the same way. 2 people, same poison, and Neil felt the weight of both. So he went into the studio in August of 1973 and recorded an entire album about exactly the death, grief, heroin, songs that sounded like they were recorded through a glass of whiskey, because they basically were. Raw, stumbling, deliberately imperfect. And then, before the album was even released, he took it on the road. Audiences who came expecting the gentle folk poet got something unrecognizable. Neil would sometimes show up looking disheveled. He'd walk out holding a beer. He'd tell the crowd point blank, "This album is about dead friends." And some people walked out. Others sat in stunned, confused silence. His label, Reprise Records, heard the finished record and refused to release it, said it was too dark, too uncommercial, potentially career-ending. So it sat on a shelf for nearly 2 years. And here's the part that still trips me up every time. Tonight's The Night was finally released in June of 1975. Critics who expected another harvest didn't know what to do with it at first. Then slowly they started to understand what they were actually hearing. Today, it's considered one of the most important albums Young ever made. Maybe the most honest, but it cost him 2 years of momentum. A tour that confused and alienated audiences who didn't sign up for a grief ritual, and a period of real professional instability. He made the most important thing he had inside him at that moment, and the world asked him to wait. Number 7, the Sex Pistols' U.S. tour, January 1978. On January 5th, 1978, the most dangerous band in the world landed in Atlanta, Georgia for their first ever American tour. 9 days later, they didn't exist anymore. You've probably heard of the Sex Pistols, even if punk wasn't your scene. Never mind the bollocks had detonated like a sonic bomb over the British music establishment the previous year. 4 young men, Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook, who looked and sounded like they'd been assembled specifically to cause maximum disruption to everything that rock music had become. And for a brief moment in 1977, it worked. The shock was real. The threat felt real. But the American tour was where the fiction met the floor. The band was already fractured before they boarded the plane. Sid Vicious was in bad shape, deep into heroin, barely functional at times, sometimes standing at the microphone holding his bass without actually playing it. And here's the part that tells you almost everything you need to know. Their manager, Malcolm McLaren, had deliberately booked the tour through the Deep South and Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, not New York, not Los Angeles, not the cities where punk had an actual audience. McLaren later said he wanted to put them somewhere hostile. Something about the authenticity of the confrontation, whether that was a calculated artistic statement or just bad management dressed up in theory, the result was predictable. The shows were chaotic. At one show, a fan threw something at Sid. Sid responded by hitting the fan in the head with his bass. That kind of thing became a pattern. Here's where it ends. January 14th, 1978, Winterland Ballroom in San Francisco. The final show, the whole American tour, 9 shows in 9 days. Johnny Rotten finishes the set, stares out at the audience, and delivers one of the most famous last lines in rock history. Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Steps off the stage, doesn't come back. The Sex Pistols are finished right there, what McLaren had built or manufactured, as the most dangerous band in the world collapsed completely under the weight of its own mythology. And some people call it art. Others call it a scam. You probably already know which side you're on. Number 6, the concert for Bangladesh Aftermath, 1971. On August 1st, 1971, George Harrison did something no musician had ever done at that scale. He looked at a humanitarian crisis and said, "I'll do something about it." He organized 2 benefit concerts at Madison Square Garden to raise money for refugees in Bangladesh, a region that had been devastated by war and a cyclone, with millions of people displaced and dying. He called in every favor he had. Bob Dylan came out of a years-long semi-retirement. Eric Clapton played, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and for one extraordinary afternoon and evening at the Garden, the shows were exactly what Harrison had intended: electric, joyful, urgent, beautiful. The live album was extraordinary. The whole thing felt like proof that musicians could actually move the needle on something that mattered. And then the money disappeared, sort of. If you were in that crowd that August, and some of you watching this were, or know someone who was, you know the energy in that building was something else entirely. What you didn't know, what almost no one knew, was what was about to happen to the funds raised. The money meant for UNICEF and Bangladesh relief got tangled up in a legal nightmare that would drag on for years. The IRS placed holds on the funds. There were disputes involving Alan Klein, who had previously managed the Beatles, and whose involvement in the project created layers of contractual and financial complication. The album was selling. The concerts had been full. The intention was completely sincere. And still, somehow, the machinery of the music industry and the tax code found a way to slow it all down to a crawl. Here's the number that matters. The full funds weren't properly released and distributed until the early 1980s for a crisis that was happening in 1971. For people who needed help now, not in a decade. George Harrison did everything right. He organized it, he showed up, he brought everyone together, and still the system turned his sincerity into a decade of paperwork. And if you've ever done something genuinely good, something clear and pure and well-intentioned, and watched the bureaucratic weight of the world complicated into something unrecognizable, you know that kind of frustration doesn't go away quickly. It settles in. George never stopped trying to get it right, but the original urgency was lost long before the money arrived. Number 5 is next, and the stories get heavier from here. Number 5, Stevie Wonder's near-fatal car accident, August 6, 1973. On August 6, 1973, Stevie Wonder was riding in a rented Mercury Cruiser passenger seat heading from Greensboro, North Carolina toward Durham. His cousin John Harris was driving. A flatbed farm truck was ahead of them on Interstate 85. The driver hit the brakes. Harris tried to swerve. The vehicles collided. The truck's bed came through the windshield. It hit Stevie directly in the forehead. He was 23 years old. He fell into a coma that lasted 4 days. Let's sit with what Stevie Wonder had already accomplished by that moment. He was in the middle of what music historians now call his classic period, a creative explosion almost unmatched in modern music history. He'd wrestled unprecedented creative control from Motown, which was almost unheard of for a black artist at that label at that time. He'd released Music of My Mind and Talking Book and Inner Visions, and that last one had come out exactly 3 days before the accident. He was mid-run, peak form, and it stopped cold. In the hospital in Winston-Salem, no one knew what was going to happen. He had a fractured skull and cerebral contusions. His head had swollen enormously. The doctors couldn't promise anything. And then a friend of his tour director, Ira Tucker, walked into that hospital room, leaned close. Barton started singing Higher Ground directly into Stevie's ear. He sang it twice before anything happened. On the second attempt, Stevie's fingers began to move, following the beat. Still there. He woke up with a permanent loss of his sense of smell and a scar on his forehead that he later said he would keep. When doctors suggested plastic surgery to remove the mark, he declined. He said he'd leave it as one of the scars of life he'd been through. He was back performing by January 1974. Within 18 months of the accident, he'd won 4 Grammy Awards, including Album of the Year. And if you're sitting here thinking, yeah, but he recovered, so it worked out, I want you to hold that thought for just a second. Because between August and January, while that man lay in a hospital bed and no one could promise his genius was still intact, we came this close to losing the rest of the classic period entirely. No fulfilling this first finale, no songs in the key of life. The math on what we almost lost is almost impossible to process. Number 4, Led Zeppelin's 1977 U.S. tour collapse. In the summer of 1977, Led Zeppelin were the biggest rock band on the planet. Not arguably, not in some circles, on the planet. They hadn't toured the United States since 1975. The tickets sold out in hours. The stage production was the largest arena rock operation anyone had ever attempted. The expectation was triumph. What they got instead was something darker than any of them could have planned for. The tour had been troubled from early on. There was a riot in Tampa. Lighting rigs caught fire in other cities. The drug use in and around the touring party had reached a level that even longtime associates described as criminal. The vibe, as one band employee later recalled, had become genuinely dark in a way no previous Zeppelin tour had been. Then on the night of July 23rd, 1977, at the Oakland Coliseum, a backstage confrontation turned violent. Members of the band's inner circle, including manager Peter Grant and drummer John Bonham, physically assaulted a security employee named Jim Matsorkis, who worked for promoter Bill Graham. It was serious enough that all 4 involved were later arrested and charged. Criminal charges, assault. Against Led Zeppelin's management and one of its founding members. The second Oakland show still happened on July 24th, only because Graham signed a complex legal indemnification allowing it. It was the last show Led Zeppelin ever played in the United States. Not because anyone planned it that way. 2 days later, on July 26th, Robert Plant received a phone call in New Orleans. His 5-year-old son, Karak, had died in England from a sudden stomach illness. Plant flew home immediately. The remaining 10 shows were canceled. Led Zeppelin never toured America again. John Bonham died in September 1980. The band disbanded that same year. The 1977 tour was supposed to be the greatest return in rock history. It ended with a father halfway across the world, a phone ringing, and a little boy gone. And when you strip everything else away, the music, the record sales, the mythology, what you're left with is that a 5-year-old child and a father who won't home. Number 3, Disco Demolition Night, July 12, 1979. On July 12, 1979, between games of a baseball doubleheader at Comiskey Park in Chicago, a radio DJ named Steve Dahl walked onto the outfield in a military helmet, pulled out a crate stuffed with disco records, wired them to a detonator, and blew them up in front of roughly 50,000 people. The explosion tore a hole in the grass, and then the crowd stormed the field. Fires were lit in the stands. The turf was torn up. The Chicago White Sox had to forfeit the second game of the doubleheader. Major League Baseball declared it an official disaster. And the story people remember is the fun one, the stunt that got out of hand, the night somebody blew up a bunch of records. But stay with me on what was actually happening underneath that. Disco. Now muscle shows it's got a small face. By 1979 was everywhere, in every genre, on every radio format, in every demographic. And there was a growing backlash from certain rock audiences that had been building momentum on rock radio stations with Disco Sucks as its rallying cry, its bumper sticker, its chant. Steve Dahl had been fired from a radio station that switched to disco format. This event was partly his personal response to that, but it became something much larger than one guy's frustration. Because here's who made disco: black artists, gay artists, Latin artists, the people who built the genre at clubs in New York City and Chicago, at venues that gave communities a space to exist, to celebrate, to be visible. These were not the same communities that classic rock radio had traditionally served. And what Disco Demolition Night organized, even if unintentionally, was a mass public ritual of rejecting the music of those communities, of burning it in a stadium in 1979 Chicago. Within months of that night, major labels had dropped or quietly shelved dozens of disco acts. The format collapsed commercially in ways it never fully recovered from. Entire careers ended, and the communities the music had been made for were pushed back to the margins of mainstream radio for years. Some people call it a stunt that got out of hand. I'll let you sit with the full picture and decide what you think it was. Number 2, the Lynyrd Skynyrd plane crash, October 20th, 1977. On October 17, 1977, Lynyrd Skynyrd released their 5th studio album, Street Survivors. The original cover showed the band surrounded by flames. 3 days later, on October 20th, a chartered Convair CV-240 took off from Greenville, South Carolina, carrying the band and their crew to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for a show at LSU. The plane ran out of fuel over Mississippi. The pilots attempted an emergency landing. They didn't make it. The aircraft came down near Gillsburg, Mississippi, in heavy woods. Ronnie Van Zant, the lead singer, the founding voice, the man who wrote Free Bird and Sweet Home Alabama and Simple Man, was killed on impact. Steve Gaines, the young guitarist who had joined the band just a year earlier and was already being described as one of the most electric players in rock, was killed. His older sister, Cassie Gaines, who sang backup for the band, was killed. The pilot and co-pilot were killed. The band's assistant road manager, Dean Kilpatrick, was killed. 6 people in total, 20 others survived. You probably already know the name Lynyrd Skynyrd, even if Southern rock isn't your thing. Freebird, Sweet Home Alabama. Music that had become almost synonymous with a specific strain of American pride and guitar DNA. And Ronnie Van Zant was the engine of all of it. The voice, the vision, the reason any of it worked.
Lord, I'm coming home to you.
Here's the thing that still gets me. Cassie Gaines had been so afraid of that particular plane that she'd actually been traveling in the equipment truck to avoid it. Van Zandt convinced her to board the plane on October 20th. She did, and that was the last flight.
Now Watergate does not about me.
The surviving members reportedly took a blood oath after the crash never to use the Lynyrd Skynyrd name again. They honored it for a full decade. 10 years of silence out of respect for the people they lost. The band didn't perform again under that name until 1987, Bart with Ronnie's younger brother Johnny on lead vocals. And if you've ever been part of something, a crew, a family, or a group of friends, anything, where one person was the irreplaceable center, and then that center was just gone overnight, you don't continue as the same thing. Not really, not ever.
But I hope you young will remember.
Number 1, The Who, Cincinnati, December 3rd, 1979. I want you to stay with me on this one, because this is the biggest music disaster of this entire decade. Not in terms of chart positions or critical reception or career damage, in terms of what it actually cost, in terms of who didn't come home. December 3rd, 1979, Riverfront Coliseum, Cincinnati, Ohio. The Who are playing a sold-out show. General admission, what they called festival seating. No assigned spots on the floor. First come, first serve. Get there early, you get close to the stage. Thousands of fans had been gathering outside the arena since early afternoon. It was cold. The show was scheduled to start at 8 p.m., but the doors weren't opening on time. There weren't enough ticket takers on duty inside, and union rules apparently prevented them from bringing in additional staff to speed things up. So the crowd outside just kept growing. By 7 p.m., an estimated 8,000 people were compressed into the Westgate Plaza, and then speakers inside the arena broadcast something, the soundtrack for the Quadrophenia film trailer, and the crowd outside heard it and believed the show was starting early. The back of the crowd pushed forward. The front of the crowd had nowhere to go. At approximately 7:20 p.m., one set of glass doors shattered from the pressure. The others were thrown open. 11 people were killed in the crush. Asphyxiation. All of them between 15 and 27 years old. Teenagers. College students, kids who'd been in line for hours because they loved The Who that much. Here's the part that's almost unbearable. The Who didn't know. Cincinnati fire officials, afraid a cancellation announcement might cause a riot, instructed the promoters to let the show go on. Roger Daltrey and Pete Townshend played the whole concert while 11 people were dying outside the building. They found out after the final encore. Their manager, Bill Kerbishley, told them backstage that there was a big problem. He'd seen the bodies. The band hadn't. Pete Townshend has talked about what that knowledge did to him over the years. He told a Cincinnati documentary crew decades later that it's a strange and heavy thing to carry, that 11 kids died at your concert, that he still isn't at peace with it. You can hear it in the way he talks about it. It hasn't softened. The city of Cincinnati banned festival seating. Concert venues across the country started reviewing their crowd management policies. Laws changed. How arenas operated changed. Not because someone decided it would be good practice, because 11 people were gone, and their families made sure no one got to forget why. The Who returned to Cincinnati in May 2022, 43 years later. Pete Townshend and Roger Daltrey donated the band's proceeds from that night to a scholarship fund in the victims' names. Some disasters in careers. Some lose money. Some change the commercial direction of an industry for a decade. And some of them just end with a mother watching the television news at home, recognizing her son's shoes in the news footage and waiting for a door to open that never does.